It was a quiet Friday afternoon when Regina Williams, a 28-year-old expectant mother, walked out of the grocery store in the peaceful suburb of Greenridge, somewhere in the state of Illinois. She had been feeling excited all day, knowing that she was just a few months away from welcoming her first child into the world. Despite being visibly pregnant and radiating joy, her calm demeanor masked a storm about to erupt. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Regina was well known in the community. She was not only the stepdaughter of Mayor Thomas Caldwell, a powerful figure who had been tirelessly working to promote unity and equality in the town, but she was also a respected activist in her own right. Regina was active in local organizations advocating for social justice and civil rights. However, this afternoon was about her family. Her life as a mother-to-be and wife was what consumed her thoughts. As she placed her bags in the trunk of her car, she noticed a police cruiser slowly rolling by. She didn't think much of it. It wasn't uncommon for cops to patrol the area, keeping the peace. But this time, something was different. Officer Derek Larson, a seasoned cop with a history of complaints for racial profiling, noticed Regina as he passed by. His eyes narrowed on her, suspicion clouding his judgment. To him, her being a young black woman, driving an upscale car and shopping in this predominantly white suburb was cause for concern. He turned his cruiser around and pulled up behind her vehicle. Without warning, Officer Larson approached Regina with hostility. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he barked. Regina, surprised by his aggressive tone, tried to remain calm. "I'm just putting my groceries in my car," she said politely, though she could feel the tension rising. "License and registration, now!" Larson demanded, his hand resting on his belt. "Officer, why? I haven't done anything wrong," Regina replied, growing anxious but maintaining her composure. His face reddened with frustration. "I said, hand over your ID. Are you going to comply, or do I need to make this difficult?" Regina began to fumble through her purse, trying to remain cooperative despite the intimidation. Her heart raced, not for herself, but for the baby growing inside her. She was just trying to get home safely. "Here," she said, extending her license and registration toward him. But Larson wasn't satisfied. His prejudice had already taken over. He refused to look at her information and instead yanked open her car door. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice growing colder. Regina froze, sensing something was horribly wrong. "Officer, I'm pregnant. Please just tell me what's going on," she said, now pleading. Without warning, Larson grabbed her by the arm and yanked her from the vehicle. Regina cried out in pain as he threw her against the side of the car. In a moment of blind rage, he punched her square in the stomach. Regina gasped, her arms instinctively wrapping around her belly. "You're resisting!" Larson shouted, though she was doing nothing of the sort. The bystanders who had begun to gather were horrified. Some pulled out their phones, recording the brutal encounter. A woman screamed for the officer to stop, but Larson ignored her, his anger blinding him to the reality of the situation. Regina, terrified and in pain, was losing her breath. "My baby, please," she whispered, barely able to speak. Just then, another police officer arrived on the scene, having been called by a witness. This officer, Officer Jamal King, rushed over and immediately assessed the situation. "Larson, what are you doing?" King yelled, horrified at what he was seeing. Regina was on the ground, clutching her stomach, and Larson still had his hand on her arm. "She's resisting!" Larson shouted, trying to justify his actions. Officer King knew better. He pushed Larson aside and knelt down to help Regina. "Ma'am, are you okay? I'm so sorry," he said softly, knowing that she was anything but fine. The crowd began closing in, with some shouting at Larson, others trying to help Regina. Regina, wincing in pain, managed to pull her phone from her pocket. She knew there was only one person she needed to call, her stepfather, Mayor Thomas Caldwell. When she dialed his number, all she could say was, "Dad, help, please." Within minutes, the scene had transformed. News of the incident had reached City Hall, and Mayor Caldwell was on his way. He was furious but composed, knowing that losing his temper would not help Regina. As his car pulled up, escorted by additional police units, The air was thick with tension. The mayor stepped out, a tall, commanding figure in his mid-60s with graying hair and the weight of leadership visible in his every movement. He pushed through the crowd, his eyes filled with concern for his daughter. When he saw Regina being tended to by paramedics, his heart sank. He rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Regina nodded weakly. "Dad, he hit me. I tried to tell him, but he wouldn't listen," she whispered through tears. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He stood up, turning his gaze to Officer Larson, who by now had realized the gravity of his actions. His face was pale, his previous arrogance replaced with fear. "Do you have any idea who you just assaulted?" Mayor Caldwell said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet fury. Larson stammered, I didn't know. You thought because she was a young black woman in a nice car, she didn't belong here." Caldwell finished his sentence. "This is my daughter, my pregnant daughter, and you put her and my grandchild in danger because of your hate and ignorance." Officer King, standing to the side, looked on with sympathy for Regina and disgust toward his colleague. "Mayor, I swear I didn't know. I thought—" "You didn't think," Caldwell interrupted. "That's the problem." Within hours, the video of the incident had gone viral, sparking outrage across the state and beyond. Mayor Caldwell used his platform to address not only the injustice that his daughter had faced, but the systemic racism that had allowed it to happen. He vowed that Officer Larson would be held accountable, and true to his word, the officer was immediately placed under investigation, stripped of his badge, and charged with assault. Regina, though shaken, recovered from the physical trauma. The baby, thankfully, was unharmed, but the emotional scars remained. However, the incident did not break her. Instead, it strengthened her resolve to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all those who had suffered under the same oppressive system. As for Officer Larson, he learned too late that his actions had not just endangered one woman's life, but had exposed the deep-seated corruption within his own department. He would forever be remembered as the cop who had punched a pregnant woman, not knowing that her father was the most powerful man in the city, and a champion for the very cause he had tried to oppress. The days following the assault were a whirlwind of media coverage, community protests, and intense scrutiny of the Greenridge Police Department. Videos of Officer Derek Larson's violent actions had circulated across social media, stirring outrage not only in Illinois but nationwide. People were shocked that such blatant racism and brutality could happen in broad daylight, especially to a pregnant woman, and many were demanding swift justice. Mayor Thomas Caldwell was at the forefront of the public outcry. Though devastated by the trauma his daughter had endured, he remained measured and determined, using his platform to address deeper issues of police misconduct, systemic racism, and the urgent need for reform. As soon as the video of the incident went viral, he called for an emergency council meeting to discuss disciplinary actions against Officer Larson. At the meeting, Mayor Caldwell addressed the city's residents and media outlets, with Regina sitting beside him. Her presence alone was powerful. Though she was still visibly shaken, she stood tall as a symbol of resilience. "I stand here not just as a father but as a mayor," Caldwell began, his voice firm. "My daughter was attacked, and the child she's carrying was put at risk. But this isn't just about her. This is about the culture that allowed an officer of the law to act with such impunity, believing that he could hurt her and get away with it. That stops now. We are going to hold him accountable, and we are going to change the system." The Greenridge community, black and white alike, gathered outside City Hall in solidarity. Many held signs that read, "Justice for Regina," and "End police brutality." The protest was peaceful, but the energy was electric. People were fed up, and Mayor Caldwell vowed that the wheels of justice would turn swiftly. Within days, Officer Larson was arrested and charged with aggravated assault, police misconduct, and violating Regina's civil rights. The charges came as a shock to many in the police department, especially those who had been accustomed to officers like Larson getting off with a slap on the wrist. But this time, there would be no cover-ups, no excuses. As the trial approached, pressure mounted on the Green Ridge Police Department to clean house. Internal investigations revealed that Officer Larson had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, most of which had been quietly dismissed by higher-ups. This time, however, there would be no escaping the truth. The entire department faced scrutiny, and several officers who had aided in covering up Larson's misconduct were placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. At the trial, Regina bravely took the stand to recount the day she was assaulted. The courtroom was packed, with reporters, activists, and members of the community eager to hear her testimony. Though reliving the trauma was difficult, Regina spoke with clarity and strength. "I was simply trying to go home," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions running high. "I complied with everything Officer Larson asked, but he didn't see me as a person. He saw my skin, and he assumed the worst. I begged him to stop, to listen, but he didn't. He hit me, knowing I was pregnant. I was scared for my life and my baby's life. And no one should ever have to feel that way at the hands of the people who are supposed to protect us." The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including the viral videos, witness testimonies, and Larson's history of racial profiling. Officer Larson, who initially maintained a cold and indifferent demeanor, began to unravel under the weight of the evidence. His defense team attempted to argue that he had acted in the heat of the moment and that he hadn't known Regina was pregnant, but the jury wasn't swayed. The video footage showed clearly that Regina had pleaded with him, explaining her condition, and Larson's aggression had only escalated. After a week of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Officer Larson was sentenced to 10 years in prison for aggravated assault and civil rights violations, with no possibility of parole for the first 5 years. In addition, the Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into the Green Ridge Police Department for systemic racial bias and misconduct. Several high-ranking officers who had ignored complaints or protected Larson were forced to resign, and a new task force was formed to oversee reforms within the department. Regina, though grateful for the justice she had received, knew this was only the beginning of a larger fight. After the trial, she gave a statement to the press, standing tall next to her stepfather. "I'm thankful that justice was served in my case, but there are so many others who don't have the same platform or the same outcome," Regina said. "This fight is far from over. We need real change. We need better training for officers, accountability for misconduct, and a system that sees us as people, not threats." Her words struck a chord with the nation. Soon after the trial, Regina's story became a rallying cry for police reform advocates across the country. Mayor Caldwell used his political connections to push for statewide reforms, advocating for mandatory body cameras, stricter oversight of police misconduct, and improved racial bias training for law enforcement officers. Regina also became a voice for change, traveling to speak at rallies and events aimed at ending police brutality. Her story inspired other victims of police violence to come forward, sparking a broader movement across Illinois and beyond. Meanwhile, Officer Larson, once a figure of authority, found himself behind bars, stripped of his badge and facing the consequences of his actions. In prison, he reflected on the choices he had made and the hatred that had fueled his career. He was no longer the untouchable cop who could get away with violence. Now he was a convicted felon, paying the price for the harm he had caused. Months passed, and Regina gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Justice, a symbol of the hard-fought battle she had won, not just for herself, but for her child and future generations. As she held her son in her arms, surrounded by her family and the community that had rallied behind her, Regina knew that while the road to equality was long, every step forward mattered. Mayor Caldwell, standing beside his daughter and grandson, vowed to continue the fight. "This is just the beginning," he said, looking out at the crowd gathered in celebration. "We will build a future where no one, no matter the color of their skin, has to fear the people sworn to protect them. Together, we will create that world." And so, the movement for justice continued, stronger than ever, fueled by the courage of one woman and the undeniable truth that change, though slow, was coming. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.